Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am refilming my BooktubeAthon wrap-up because I lost all the footage from the first time around. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this pretty quickly, because this video was supposed to be done by now. The 2018 BooktubeAthon ran for 1 week from the end of July through the beginning of August. I'll provide the social media links down below for the BooktubeAthon so you can find them and follow them and know about future iterations of this readathon. The ultimate goal, as always, for the BooktubeAthon was to read 7 books. I managed 6 this time around, which I think was pretty good. All the books I read ended up being either middle grade or young adult. The one adult book I had on my TBR was the one I did not get to. So the first challenge of the BooktubeAthon this year was to let a coin toss determine your first read, and that coin toss chose for me The Changeling Sea by Patricia McKillip. Now I'm considering this YA, even though most of McKillip's books are adult, because this seems to have been published as YA, and reading it, I actually do agree with that assessment. It feels more YA than other things I have read by McKillip. Certainly it's the sort of book I would have absolutely loved when I was in middle school and high school, and so I am sort of mad that I did not know about this book or about McKillip as an author back then. The protagonist of this book is a younger teen. She's about 14, maybe, I don't remember her exact age, but her name is Perry, short for Periwinkle, and she lives in a fishing village, a small fishing village in a island kingdom. Some time ago, her father was lost at sea, and following that, her mother has become very detached and sort of lost in her own mind. And so Perry has become sort of a wild child. She doesn't live at her mother's house anymore. She's spending most of her time at the abandoned house or cottage of this old woman who mysteriously vanished. Now, before she vanished, this old woman, who may or may not have actually been a witch or had some sort of magical knowledge, it's never entirely clear, but she had been teaching Perry hexes. And since Perry is furious at the sea for taking her father and indirectly also taking her mother from her, she has been trying to hex the sea. Then into this picture rides the prince of this kingdom, Kier, and he comes to the cottage looking for the old woman and finds Perry instead. It turns out he has come to believe that he is actually a changeling of some sort. The sea seems to be calling to him, and he thinks that he actually comes from the kingdom under the sea. The village is also soon reeling with spottings of a sea dragon with a golden chain around its neck that goes down into the sea. And the villagers want to break the chain so they can take the gold for themselves. This story sort of has the feeling of like a classic fairy tale retelling. It's not a retelling, it's an original fantasy story, but you could almost reverse engineer in your mind the fairy tale that this would be a retelling of if it were. I love the magical feel of McKillip's writing. This is definitely a setting where, like, magic is real, but not super flashy and not everywhere all the time. It's also not codified in some sort of magic system. It's really organic, and not all of it has to be shown on the page. I love the feel in this book of how the kingdom under the sea sort of looms large in all of the characters' imaginations, despite the fact that we never actually go there in the book. The kingdom under the sea isn't someplace you get to just by, like, jumping off a boat and swimming. It is a true, like, other world. And you get such a strong sense of it in this book. So I did think this book was just lovely. The one real qualm that I had with it was that the resolution of the romance plotline felt really abrupt to me. It kind of came out of left field. I think the romance plot point that happened at the end there could have just not happened, and I would have not known that I was missing it. As it is, I felt like it needed some more build-up in order for me to really buy it. So I gave this 4 stars. This isn't my favorite McKillip I've read so far. I think that's still the Bell at Sealy Head. I'd say in terms of writing style, this was published in the 80s, so that's in between the older McKillip books that I've read and Bell at Sealy Head, which is kind of newer. And it does feel like it has somewhere sort of in between the more old-fashioned writing style of those older books and something more modern. It really does feel like this beautiful, short, sweet fairy tale. The next book I read was The Dragon with a Chocolate Heart by Stephanie Burgis. This is a middle grade book about a dragon girl named Aventurine, who is a rebellious little dragon girl. She's angry about the fact that she's too young to be let out of the caves to go hunting. She wants to be fierce and ferocious, and so in order to prove that she is fierce and ferocious enough to survive outside the caves, she runs away. She does not get far, though, before she meets a food mage who gives her enchanted hot chocolate that turns her into a human girl. Now Aventurine can't go back to her family because they won't recognize her and they will try to kill her, so she has to go to the human city and try to find work there. Thankfully, she knows what she wants to do. She wants to become an apprentice chocolatier, because she has discovered that chocolate is the most amazing thing ever. By the way, I read this for the challenge, which was to read a book about something you want to do, and I decided this counts because I, of course, want to eat chocolate. So when Aventurine arrives in the city and has to try to figure out how human civilization works, she discovers snobbery in the chocolate industry. There are 3 chocolate houses in the city, 2 of which care more about sucking up to the ultra-rich than they do about actually making good chocolate. Both of these will only take you as an apprentice if you're from a super wealthy family, and Aventurine does not get either of those apprenticeships. The 3rd chocolate house in the city is run by a woman who cares only for pure good chocolate, and Aventurine finds a kindred spirit and a home there. But Aventurine's beloved chocolate house is in danger from its competitors, and there are those who would like to see it shut down. And this is the story of Aventurine trying to save her chocolate house and figure out where she truly belongs. So this was cute, it was fun, it was basically as advertised, but I didn't love it. I know it's a short book and it's for kids, but there's a lot that felt really, really rushed in here to me. The quickness with which Aventurine adjusted to a lot of the fundamental basics of being human and having a human body felt unrealistic, if, expedient for the story. Same with the speed at which she settled into her apprenticeship at the chocolate house and learned to make chocolate there. So I don't think this is going to turn out to be a particularly memorable reading experience for me, but it was fun and I gave it 3 stars. The next challenge was to read and watch a book-to-movie adaptation, and so for this I read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, and I watched the movie adaptation, The Wizard of Oz. Now, I was not previously actually super familiar with either version of this story. Like, I basically know the story because it's really in the public consciousness. I remembered seeing the movie as a kid, but I didn't remember most of the details about it, mostly just the songs. And I am pretty sure that one or the other of my parents read at least the first couple of the books in this series to me when I was younger, and I have basically no memory of that whatsoever. I should mention that this edition that I read has the original color illustrations, which are lovely. Now, this was first published in the year 1900, turn of the 20th century, and in the introduction, L. Frank Baum says that his goal in writing this book was to write a fairy tale story for children that would purely entertain. There had been in the 19th century this sort of movement where everything that was for children had to have a strong moral, it had to teach. And you'll see that, like, fairy tales of the 19th century have all this strong Christian moralizing to them, and this was sort of meant as a counter-argument. And so this book does have that sort of older-fashioned fairy tale feel, including the fact that a lot of what happens just feels very, very random and sometimes slightly disturbing. So I think this is kind of a case where I really truly appreciate the intent, but not necessarily the result. This seems to me like a really worthy attempt on the way to like modern literary fairy tale fantasy, but we're just not quite there yet. It does have this very simplistic, straightforward writing style, which, as I sometimes find with older fairy tales, feels kind of at odds with like the really bizarre things that are happening. That's not to say that there aren't like thematic lessons in here. There are. There's obviously the theme of like what true brains and heart and courage really are, that they're not something that's going to be magically bestowed by a wizard. That is also, of course, one of the themes of the movie, though it's treated somewhat differently between the two. And I do want to compare this to the movie a bit. I think that one of the main differences is that it's just longer, like the story goes on for a good while after the point where the movie decides to end it and send Dorothy home. Dorothy and her companions then have to travel south and meet a few more obstacles and strange peoples before they find Glinda in the south. But there are some things that I specifically like better in the book than the movie. First of all, I really do enjoy the fact that the first good witch that Dorothy meets in this book when she's with the Munchkins is not Glinda, it's a different good witch of the north who is like this jolly old lady. And then I watched the movie and there's that whole exchange about like, oh no, good witches are young and beautiful, only old witches are old and ugly. And I was like, that is total unnecessary nonsense that was not in the book at all. The other thing I really like in the book that was almost completely diminished in the movie was the flying monkeys. I had kind of remembered the flying monkeys being a bigger deal in the movie, and they're barely there at all. They're like in one scene for atmosphere. In case you do not know, in the book, the flying monkeys aren't inherently evil. They're just like bound to perform 3 tasks for whoever has this magical cap that commands them. And when our companions encounter the Wicked Witch, she has 1 wish left in her cap, and she uses it against them. And then after the witches vanish, Dorothy has the cap and gets to use it 3 times. And then at the end, she gives it to Glinda, who uses it to free the flying monkeys. And that's just so much better. Another difference that was actually something I remembered about this story, so I must have somehow remembered it from the book, that I was then surprised wasn't in the movie, is the fact that the Emerald City isn't actually green. It only looks green because everyone there has to wear these green goggles all the time, and it's all a big part of the wizard's deceptive sham. I remembered that. That did not surprise me when I read it in the book, and then when I watched the movie again, I was like, wait, is the city actually green in the movie? Surprise! And then the big thing that the movie does that I, of course, do not approve of at all is bringing back this whole heavy-handed moralizing thing that L. Frank Baum was specifically trying not to do. With the whole extended opening sequence of Dorothy wanting to leave home and meeting all of these characters, and then the whole fantasy journey being explicitly like a dream because she gets hit on the head by like a flying shutter, and then she wakes up at the end and oh, it was all a dream and I never want to leave home again. And it's like, first of all, that's also kind of creepy because they aged her up in the movie and she's like a teenager, and like, isn't it kind of normal that a teenager would start to think about whether or not they maybe want to live somewhere other than their aunt and uncle's farmhouse at some point in their life? Yeah, I am just not a fan of the whole it was all a dream in order to teach me that I will never leave home again. For the record, in the book, it is all 100% absolutely real. By the time Dorothy gets home, her aunt and uncle have had to build a second farmhouse because the first one got whisked away to a magical land in a tornado. And in the book, the no place like home message isn't treated like, you know, the major big thing that Dorothy has to learn. She's a pretty little kid in the book. It is completely normal if a little kid is separated from the adults who take care of them that of course she's gonna try to get back home. That's just like something that's taken for granted. That said, I do really love the actual Oz sections of the movie. There's something about the way that movie is made that really captures all of the feelings of wonder and enchantment that the book and its writing style didn't actually quite do for me. So I am glad that I have read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It's not an all-time favorite of mine by any means, though. I would give this 3 stars. And the next thing I read was a very short middle-grade graphic novel, and that was Hilda and the Bird Parade by Luke Pearson. This is the 3rd of the Hilda graphic novels that follow this little girl named Hilda and her magical adventures. There is, in fact, a newly released Netflix animated series adaptation of these graphic novels, which I am very, very excited to start watching as soon as I can catch up with the books. Just like all the other books in this series, this is just totally charming. Following the events of Hilda and the Midnight Giant, Hilda and her mom have had to leave their house in the valley where Hilda has lived all of her life, and they've moved to the big city of Trollberg. Hilda is very frustrated because she's not allowed to go running around by herself to play in the city like she was back home. She tries to make some friends. It doesn't go so great. Their games don't make sense to her. She ends up leaving this group of kids and instead keeping the company of a crow or raven, I'm not sure exactly which it is, a talking bird who has been hit on the head and is kind of confused. This bird thinks there's something very important that he has to remember and that he's kind of important and has something important he needs to do, but he can't remember what. And Hilda decides to try to help him out. I want to give a shout out to Hilda's mom as the series goes on. I like her more and more. She is just a very good mom. And I want to say that I now want to live in Trollberg because I wish I lived in a city that had an annual, like, mythic bird parade, because the bird parade just looked awesome. As always, this series is like full of folklore-y stuff, and I think it's just so sweet, and I gave this 4 stars. So I took a break there, I'm back, and next I'm going to talk about Nurk, The Strange, Surprising Adventures of a Somewhat Brave Shrew by Ursula Vernon. This is a middle grade or maybe slightly younger kids book. It is pretty heavily illustrated by Ursula Vernon, and this was very cute. This is about a cautious young shrew named Nurk who lives alone in his family's ancestral home but dreams of someday being an adventurer like his grandmother Circa. One day he receives a letter addressed to someone whose name has been blurred out a bit, but it looks like Urk, and so he opens it. But it turns out this was probably definitely a letter for Circa from downstream asking for help. And despite, oh, the terror, having committed mail fraud by opening someone else's mail, because that is Ursula Vernon's sense of humor, Nurk eventually decides that he is going to set off and try to find who sent the letter. He sets off down the river in his snail boat that he makes out of a snail shell, and meets the dragonflies, which in this book are not like literal dragonflies, they are like little dragon critters with like insect wings. And of course adventures ensue. This was charming, this was funny, this was very short. I used this for the challenge of read a book while wearing the same hat the entire time. The hat I used was this one because it kind of matches the color scheme of the book. I gave this 4 stars. And then the last book I finished, actually, I think I've got these in reverse order. I think I finished Nurk last, and In the Hand of the Goddess by Tamora Pierce second to last. I used this for the challenge to read a book with a pretty spine. I think the spines of these editions are rather nice. I've never read the Tortall books before, so this is my first read-through of this series ever. And like the first book, I found this to be really compulsively readable, really pure fun. This follows Alana, who is still disguised as a boy training to be a knight during her time as a squire now to Prince Jonathan up until she passes the ordeal of knighthood and becomes a knight herself. The main conflict with a villain that happens throughout this book is a lot of fun. There is, you know, some sword fighting and stuff that's also very entertaining. So the basic plot was fundamentally a thumbs up for me. But there's this other thing going on in this book where basically, like, this is the love triangle book of the series, I guess. And I am not fundamentally opposed to love triangles as a trope, but I wasn't fond of this one. Basically what happens at the beginning is Alana has an encounter with her sort of patron goddess, and the goddess tells her that she's afraid of love and she has to learn how to love. And I think by the end of the book, it is pretty clear that that message is meant to be broader than just romantic love. She has to learn that there are all these people in her life who she can trust and who she will fight to defend in return. But there's this love triangle going on, which is basically framed as these two guys trying to convince her that even though she, like, doesn't want to be in a relationship and doesn't want to get married, that, like, she needs to fall in love with them. And basically they were both being jerks about it, and they are literally the only two, like, eligible men at this point who know that she's a girl, and, like, she has to choose one of them. I'm like, no, Alana, there have to be better options than this. When I read this, I made, like, very specific mental notes about what was basically wrong with both of these guys in their behavior towards her. And it was long enough ago now that I've kind of forgotten, but, like, one of them is literally described as stalking her. And then I think he kisses her without her consent. And then he's like, I understand if you don't want to be with me now, but, like, I will wait for you until you come to me. I'm like, that's the creepiest thing ever. And then I think the other guy just gets, like, weirdly possessive of her and, like, has some sort of speech about, like, how they're destined to be together, can't she understand? And I'm like, no, stop it. Let her, like, make her own choices. And it just pissed me off, because, like, otherwise in this story, these characters are both, like, really good supportive friends of her, and then the moment it gets, like, even a trifle romantic, they turn into creepy jerks. But even though it sounds like I'm really angry about that, and I kind of am, it really is a small enough portion of the book that I still gave this 3 stars for overall enjoyment. I mean, there's a magical cat in this. How can you not love it? I also found it really interesting in this edition. There's an afterword by Tamora Pierce from 2014 about some of the context about, you know, what had and had not been published in terms of feminist fantasy, fantasy with female protagonists, by the time that she was writing and publishing these books, and the historical context of what that was kind of like to be one of those authors who was trying to invent the idea of a female hero in a traditionally male role. It's also interesting to me that she mentioned that these first 2 books in her series came out within the same couple years or so as Robin McKinley's Damar books, The Blue Sword and The Hero and the Crown. And so you can definitely see some sort of convergent evolution happening within the genre there. I, of course, am a huge McKinley fan, and the Damar books are the ones that I read as a teenager, and I prefer them to these so far, but I am going to keep reading this series. I gave this 3 stars. So there is what I read for the BooktubeAthon. The one book from my TBR that I did not get to was Witches of Lichford, which would have been the only adult book on my TBR. So that is how I ended up with all middle grade and YA. But that book was supposed to fulfill the challenge of read a book with green on the cover. And that was the one I ended up skipping because one of the other books that I was reading, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, also has a decent amount of green on the cover. So I did in fact hit that challenge. Anyhow, if you'd like to chat about any of these books, please do leave me a comment. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.